Hello everyone. Welcome to today's webinar on improving your product team's performance. My name is Rihanna Collier. I'm Vice President of the Software and Services Division here at SIIA. And I am delighted to be joined by Greg Geracie today, who is President of Actuation Consulting. Each year, or for the past few years, the SIIA has partnered with Actuation on an annual survey that they do to provide us some data on improving our product team performance. And we're lucky that Greg is here today to talk to us a little bit about the last year's findings and getting ready to kick off this year's survey for anybody that wants to participate, and maybe talk a little bit about how things have changed between the 2 years and in the findings. Before we get started, just a couple of housekeeping reminders. All of your phone lines are on mute. We will be recording today's webinar, so everyone will receive a copy of the recording and the presentation following the conclusion of today's webinar. We do want to answer all of your questions. Jumps a little too forward. We want to answer all your questions, so please ask them through the chat box there on the left of your screen. Again, all your phone lines are on mute, so we'll be taking questions just through the chat box there. Go ahead and ask your questions throughout the course of Greg's presentation. We will gather all those questions and address all of them after the official presentation. But we want to make sure we definitely get to everybody's questions. So don't hold back, or we don't want you to forget those questions as the time goes on. Before I turn it over to Greg, just a couple of reminders of upcoming events the SIIA is producing. Our Deciphering series of events kicks off on February 23rd in Irvine, California with our Customer Success event. We follow that with our first finance event of the year in Nashville, Tennessee on March 16th. And then our Product Management event April 20th in Dallas, Texas. There will be multiple of these events throughout the course of the year in various cities around the U.S. and Canada. If you want to get involved in any of them, some of the focuses that are not up here are also marketing, CEO, and I think, what am I missing? Marketing, CEO, finance, customer success, product, and maybe that's it. So if you want to get involved in any of those, my email address is there on the screen. Please feel free to drop me a note. We'd love to have your participation, either from a speaking perspective, sponsoring, or simply just attending. They're great events where you get to join your like peers to really discuss ways to not only improve your company strategy, but also your own professional development. So I encourage you to take a look at those, and certainly let me know if you would like to be involved. So with that, I want to go ahead and jump right in and turn it over to Greg to give us kind of an overview of 2015 and what we're looking for coming into 2016. So Greg?
Great. Thank you, Rihanna. Welcome everyone to today's webcast. It's a pleasure to be here with you today, and I look forward to sharing the findings from our 2015 study of product team performance, which was the 4th year that we've been conducting this study, and as Rihanna indicated, we're actually entering our 5th year, and we just opened the survey a couple days ago, and I'll show you a link in case you are interested to participate with us this year. So by way of background, my name is Greg Geracie. I'm the President of Actuation Consulting. We're the leading product management consulting and training organization. And I'm also an adjunct professor at the University of DePaul, where I teach at the College of Computing and Digital Media. In fact, I teach one of only 2 courses to undergraduates and graduates in the entire United States in product management. I'm also an author of 2 books on the subject of product management. The first is Take Charge Product Management, which is geared towards those stepping into the field for the very first time. And I'm also the editor-in-chief for the Product Management and Marketing Body of Knowledge, where I worked with Stephen Eppinger of the Massachusetts Institute of Technology. And we worked with 60 of the industry's leading thought leaders to actually build out the content for the Product Management and Marketing Body of Knowledge. So on to a little bit about today's presentation. So let's dive in to the factors that drive high performance on product teams. The presentation is broken into 3 areas. The first is really a demographic area where we learn a little bit about the respondents who participated in the study and a little bit about them so that we have set some context, if you will, to understand the responses. The second area is really looking at performance, and we'll look at performance on product teams at 3 levels. The overall team, the product team itself, and then the product manager as well as the user experience. These were 2 areas that we dove into in this year's survey. And also we'll get into some regression analysis findings. Every year we use a third-party statistician to take the data that's generated by the survey instrument and then conduct regression analysis on the data. And this year there were 4 key findings that emerged that add to our growing body of knowledge. We now have 20 factors that we've discovered since the inception of the study back in 2012. So I'll share the latest factors with you. So first, about the survey method, the way that it works is we work with sponsors and authors and promotional partners to distribute a web-based version of the survey to a wide variety of people. Typically about 1,500 different organizations participate each year in the survey. The first year that we conducted the study, it was around 1,150. It's since grown to over 1,500, and we expect probably 1,600 companies or so this year. The survey itself is completely anonymous, and there is an optional disclosure. We usually offer some type of raffle item to get people to provide us with their information if they are so interested. This year it happens to be an Apple gift card. Last year it was an Apple iPad mini. The goal, though, is to hear from every role on product teams, which is why it's so important that we collaborate with organizations like SIIA. We want to hear from people at a variety of different roles, and in fact all the roles of people on product teams. For example, business analysts, development managers, engineers, product managers and owners, program managers and project managers, and user experience professionals, etc. So this isn't meant to be an exhaustive list, but it's to give you a sense of the different types of roles that reside on product teams and the voices that we want to hear from. So a little bit about who responded to the survey. So this sets up our discussion. So first of all, 92% of respondents play an active role in 2015 in creating or enhancing their company's products or services. If we look back over the course of the last 4 years, this number typically ranges between 92 to 95%, so very consistent year over year. And in fact, when you look at the individual percentages of who responded, you can see that both product managers and project managers were tied for the top spot in 2015. The project manager number jumped up pretty significantly from the prior year due to support of one of our sponsors. And then program managers and others closely behind product managers and project managers. Program managers at 15% and others, those not represented by the various percentages here, sort of all aggregated in this one slice of the pie under other, reside in the third spot, program managers in the fourth. And then you can see that engineers at 9.1%, development managers at 8.2%, business analysts at 7.8%, and so on. So we have a very good representation of the various different roles. The area that we typically have the least participation from are brand managers and user experience professionals, who we seem to have the most difficulty engaging. We work closely with UXPA in the past, the User Experience Professionals Association, and that's helped to move the numbers up, and we're always looking to try to grow those numbers to get a more representative sample and to hear from those particular roles. In terms of the titles that our survey respondents report to, 60% of our respondents report to either a company officer, a VP, or a director. As you'll note here, the single largest group is manager at 31%, followed by director at 28.1%, company officer at 17.3%, and vice presidents at 14.1%, and others makes up 9.5%. So once again, a very good representative sample, fairly evenly spread. From a demographic standpoint, as it relates to primary business focus, 43% of our survey respondents work in the technology industry, and this, yet again, is a fairly consistent number year over year. It usually ranges between 43 to 48%. Notice that the second largest group is, in fact, the service industry at 24%. Followed by consumer products at 10%, and then since this doesn't add up to 100, the two groups that are missing are both government and education, which round out the pie. Also, in terms of annual revenues, it's helpful to understand that about a third of organizations have less than $50 million in annualized revenues. As you might expect, the middle pie from $50 million to $2 billion actually is at 40%, and the largest slice of the pie, if you will. And then 27% of survey respondents work in organizations of over $2 billion in annualized revenue. So once again, a good distribution. So let's dive into the heart of the presentation now that we've sort of got a context for who responds to the survey, at least for 2015. Let's talk a little bit about what respondents told us about their product teams. So first of all, we asked the following question: which of the following best describes the effectiveness of your product team? And what's interesting here is if you look at the pie for a minute, you notice that 47% of survey respondents say that we deliver value but lack consistency in execution, which was the most significant response. That was followed by we deliver value consistently on scope, schedule, and cost at 39% approximately. 11% said we're hit or miss, and then the final survey respondent group at about 3% said we miss more than we hit. So what we can see here is a fairly consistent theme that we've seen over the years where basically the number of people who are responding that we deliver value consistently on scope, schedule, and cost has been increasing. If you look to the right, you'll notice sort of a stepped series of numbers. I plotted for the last 4 years the responses from 2012 to 2015 to give you a sense of historically what the trend has been on this. And if you think about it, back in 2012, we were pretty much in the depth of the recession, and only 13% of organizations at that point in time said that they delivered value consistently on scope, schedule, and cost. As the recession started to lift in 2013, it moved up 8 percentage points to 21. And the following year, up 12 percentage points to 33%. And then as of this year, 39% approximately of survey respondents said that they were delivering more accurately on delivering value more consistently on scope, schedule, and cost. So it's pretty clear that this trend appears highly correlated to positive changes in the economy and also with staffing levels. So to give you a sense also about the various historical product development methodology adoption rates that we've been tracking, this is a bar chart basically that illustrates a question that we've been asking consistently for the last couple of years around which product development methodology various product development teams are utilizing. And if you look at this chart for a second, you'll notice that the blue bars actually represent the responses in 2012. In 2013, it's represented by gray, and then the sort of chartreusey green represents 2014. So let's turn our attention first to blended. If you look at blended, back in 2012, almost 53% of survey respondents indicated that they were utilizing blended methodologies. It fell fairly dramatically in 2013 by 10 percentage points, roughly, down to 43%. And then in 2014, the number popped up a little bit more to 45.41%. So all in all, fairly consistent. And as we'll see when I show you the 2015 numbers, there's a fairly consistent trend here while it's still in the low to mid 40s. If we turn our attention then for a second to Agile, the far left-hand side, you'll notice that in 2012, only 12.83% of survey respondents said they were utilizing Agile methodologies to develop their products. In 2013, however, you can notice an exponential jump from roughly 13% to 30%. It was a huge growth year for the adoption of Agile methodologies. In 2014, we saw that the number continued to rise, roughly 10%, up to 33.16. Interestingly, though, in 2015, which I'll show you in a second, we saw a break with this trend line. Let's turn our attention to waterfall for a second. In 2012, you can see that waterfall was at 18%. In 2013, it dropped by roughly a third, down to 12.5%, and then ultimately it fell in 2014 another 2.5% approximately, down to 10.2%. We began tracking Kanban in 2014 as a methodology, and so we don't have trend data. And what we did was replace Kanban, we replaced Lean with Kanban, as there was some confusion by those who weren't clear on exactly what Lean meant, whether we meant Lean startup or Lean sort of cost efficiency methodologies. So since we realized that there was some confusion about that, we switched from Lean to Kanban, which we continued to track in the out years. So on to the 2015 information, here's what we found from what survey respondents told us about the methodologies in 2015. You'll notice that the blended methodologies are still dominant at 43%, and as I mentioned earlier, for the last 3 years, this number really hasn't changed much. It's ranged between 43 to 45% year over year, so pretty consistent. Well, interestingly, what we saw for the very first time was a break in the Agile growth rate. If you recall, in the previous slide, Agile was in the 30 range, and in fact, what we see now is basically about a 6% drop from the prior year in Agile, in respondents indicating that they were utilizing Agile methodologies, and in fact, this translated into the very first decrease in responses on Agile. Conversely, waterfall actually increased for the very first time to 13.5%. I think it's too early to say, based on the 2015 findings, whether this is in fact a trend and that Agile is potentially losing steam. I think we should see in this year's results whether this is an aberration, the 2016 survey, whether this is an aberration or whether this is the beginning of some kind of trend that we identified. So more to come on that. Notice also that Kanban jumped up from roughly 2.5 to 3.2 in this year, and then about 11% of survey respondents don't know which methodology their organization is using as it relates to developing their products. So once again, keeping an eye on methodologies, but focusing this time on profitability, or perceptions of profitability, we asked the following question: which methodology do you associate with increasing the profitability of your product? And as you can see here, while blended is the methodology that is most in use in terms of practical application within product teams, what we actually have going on here is that Agile Scrum methodologies in particular are those that are perceived as having the most favorable impact on profitability, roughly by 10 percentage points more than those that are effectively using them today. Notice that 36.3% of survey respondents indicated that Agile methodologies were in fact the ones that had the most positive impact on the profitability of a product. Notice that blended methodologies fell roughly 11 points from 43% down to 32.3. So while that's the second largest response group, many of those appear to believe that in fact Agile, pure Agile, as opposed to blended methodologies, a combination of waterfall and some Agile, is in fact the better route to go as it relates to profitability. 18% of survey respondents didn't actually know which methodology would have a more favorable impact. Only 6% of those that responded said that waterfall would actually have the most favorable impact on profitability, so that number is really quite small and far less than those that respond that they're using waterfall in 2015, and once again Kanban's numbers increase. Now it's worth noting here for a second that we get asked a lot whether we believe that, given the interest in Agile, that waterfall will someday go away. In our view, basically, waterfall is a very viable process that can be used in highly regulated industries, for example, pharmaceutical or medical device industry, where a high level of documentation is required. So we don't believe that waterfall will ever, fully be eliminated as a process. Although I think it has been pretty clear for the 3 years prior to last year that waterfall was on a pretty steady decline, and it'll be interesting to see where those numbers come in this year. One other thing that we wanted to focus on as it relates to product team performance was some information around job satisfaction levels. What we found this year was that 63% of product team members are currently satisfied or extremely satisfied with their jobs. 24.5% are somewhat dissatisfied, and only about 12.3% are either dissatisfied and staying put or actively looking to exit at 5.1%. Although these numbers are relatively small and it appears that the majority of product team members are satisfied or extremely satisfied with their jobs, this small percent, this 5.1%, actually has a pretty significant impact on performance. Here we take a closer look at turnover's impact, and what you'll see is that in fact 54% of survey respondents state that turnover has negatively impacted their ability to be able to execute. So if we look at the top two bars, notice it says significant and moderate, and it says turnover has resulted in missing major deadlines or serious quality issues, or turnover has had some impact on our ability to be able to deliver. So while the numbers are relatively small, the impact of turnover is really quite large. All right, so let's turn our eye from the product team to product management, which we dug into a little bit with some specific questions this year. And the first one we wanted to ask our product team members who participated in the survey was a little bit about innovation leadership. And as you'll note here, the majority of survey respondents believe that product management at 21.3% is responsible for leading innovation in their organizations, and it's followed in second place by a special cross-functional team which is appointed by our executives. And then the third largest group is another thought-leading executive team member other than product management at about 14.6%. And then you can see a fairly big spread, mostly to those with elevated titles, a company founder, a CEO, a CTO, a VP of engineering. Interestingly, almost 9% of survey respondents said none of the above. We don't incubate innovative or disruptive products in our organization. So there's a little bit of a backstory that isn't maybe readily apparent, but when you overlay size of company on top of the survey responses, what you end up finding is in fact an innovation continuum that showed up in our data. So in the small companies below $50 million in revenue, it tends to be a C-level executive, a company founder, a CEO, et cetera, that is leading innovation-related activities. However, as noted to the right, product team members, particularly in companies of scale from 50 million up to 2 billion, believe that product management should lead innovation activities, although I think it's safe to say that that's not the case in all organizations, but there is an expectation that product management plays the leadership role in innovation leadership, if you will, for organizations between 50 million and 2 billion. Above 2 billion, though, the picture changes once again, and in fact, survey respondents told us above $2 billion in annualized revenue that a special cross-functional team appointed by our executives is in fact the preferred option for innovation leadership. We also wanted to ask a question as it relates to product management's time spent in the field with customers. In fact, what we found was that roughly from a product team perspective, that about 28% of product team members believe that product managers spend between 1 to 15% of their time in the field. In fact, another 27%, almost 28%, believe that product managers spend between 15 to 30% of their time in the field, and about 13%, 12.5%, say more than 30. There are a pretty significant proportion of individuals who say that their product managers never or rarely leave the building at 15%, and 10% say they don't know, and 6.5% say we don't have product managers. When you overlay the responses specifically from product managers and product owners, what we find is that the product team members in fact have a little bit more optimistic view of how product managers are spending their time with an eye towards being out in the field. In fact, only 44%, or I should say 44% of product managers say they spend between 1 to 15% of the time in the field, and 21% say they rarely, if ever, leave the building. So the perception that product team members have as opposed to what product managers say they're actually doing is slightly different. When it comes to backlog prioritization, once again with an eye towards product management, you'll notice that product managers and product owners are clearly in the lead as it relates to ownership of the backlog. 29% of respondents said product managers, 15.4 said product owners. So 45% of backlogs are actively being prioritized by product managers and product owners, which is good news. Notice, though, the yellow part of the pie chart where no single owner of the backlog is being represented. That represents 25% of survey respondents. And then the rest are being spread pretty evenly, as you might expect, once again, similar to innovation, probably with smaller organizations with C-level or functional leads. So the good news here is that the majority of product managers are apparently in control of their backlogs, and that's a good thing. Shockingly, one of the things that we found related to product management accountability metrics, and the issue that we saw emerge here was first and foremost, that customer satisfaction is the #1 way that product managers are being measured. Now, that's not a bad thing, but when you turn your eye to the right, to the purple column, you'll notice that almost a third of organizations say their product managers are not being held accountable to any metrics. That's a bit disturbing. And if you look to the left, you'll notice that as it relates to top-line revenue, profitability, market share, or velocity and throughput metrics, these are being tracked by only a minority of organizations in an effort to hold their product managers accountable. So I think what underlies this is the fact that very few product managers, and we know this from a past survey where we found only 19% of product managers actually have P&L or financial responsibility. So I think what we see reflected here is the fact that since product managers don't actually have the necessary tools to effectively manage their products from a financial standpoint, that what they're being held accountable to when they are being held accountable is the customer satisfaction. Obviously, organizations typically track customer satisfaction and have mechanisms in place to be able to document those numbers, and as such it's become the default tracking mechanism, although a valuable one that product managers are being held accountable to. So customer satisfaction is the single most commonly used performance metric with product managers. That was not something we expected, actually, when we asked originally respondents in the survey. So let's shift our lens for a minute to user experience. In 2014, the prior year study, user experience popped up for the very first time. In fact, we found that the inclusion of talented UX professionals was an additive component to a strong product team culture. The other 4 elements that made up the survey response, in terms of the regression analysis findings, were a common goal which united the team, strong engineers and the recognition of their importance to the team, an effective project manager or scrum master, and the reason that's important is it allows the other team members to focus on those things that they do well, and a bit surprisingly, particularly for those who are proponents of Agile type methodologies, effective line management. There's a concept of self-organizing teams within an Agile framework, but what we basically found was, and what survey respondents told us, was that effective line management, so those in roles above members directly on the team, actually had a very accretive role to play in that they were able to provide additional resources, support, mentoring, and counseling, things along those lines that actually help product teams be more effective. So this effective line management component actually also stood out a little bit in our findings. But I want to turn our focus back to the inclusion of talented UX professionals. This triggered us to look a little bit more closely at what was going on with user experience within the context of product teams. So the first question we asked had to do with reporting relationships and where UX reports today. And in fact, roughly 30% of UX professionals report into engineering. You see 29.8% circled in red, engineering, development, technology, or similar. And you'll notice on the left-hand side, the orange part of the pie, that basically product management has UX reporting into it about 26% of the time. The chief product officer has UX responsibilities about 8% of the time. So relatively small percentages there. Notice that marketing is pretty significant at 12.2, as is technology architecture, product architecture at 11.4. We then asked the question, where should UX professionals report for increased effectiveness? And interestingly, what we found was survey respondents told us that 56% of respondents believe that UX would be most effective reporting into the product organization. And that would be either to the Chief Product Officer, where you see the number has doubled here at about 17%, or product management, which increased by roughly a third. Notice that engineering, development, technology, or similar has decreased pretty significantly down to 17.7, roughly 18%. And marketing was cut in half from 12 to 6%. So we believe that there's a trend taking place here that should be confirmed with this year's data, where we see a shift of the user experience professionals making a move from the engineering side of the equation more directly to the product side, and we should be able to document that in this year's results, assuming that this is a trend, which we believe it is. So let's get into the key findings for 2015. And there were 4 factors that came up in our regression analysis. The very first had to do with strategic decision-making aptitude. The second has to do with something a little bit more tactical, stand-up frequency, and what we found there was the more frequently that stand-ups are being held, the better product teams tended to perform. Also, quick problem recovery came up in our regression analysis this year, so nimbleness on the product teams and overcoming unforeseen issues. And the fourth had to do with incorporating user experience, and we'll talk more about that in a second. So as it relates to strategic decision making, we asked the following question: does your organization do an effective job at decision making in order for the product team to successfully develop products? And the responses that respondents had available to them were listed here. And it starts off with, we're good at making and sticking with decisions as it relates to technical areas. So you notice that 50% of survey respondents said that they were very good at technical decisions. 45% said they were very good at product requirement decisions. And only a little over a third, at 37%, said they were good at strategic decisions. However, what we found in our regression analysis was that those teams that had an aptitude at strategic decision making, making and sticking with their decisions, perform better in terms of the data. Note that go-to-market decisions and we struggle in all these areas round out the list at around a third. As it relates to stand-up frequency, we also found that there's a high correlation with high performance on product teams tied to the stand-up frequency. The more frequently stand-ups are being held, the more likely it is that a team will be performing at a higher level. So what we see here basically is the top 2 groups. Stand-ups are an effective cornerstone of our product development process and conducted daily, or stand-ups are an effective cornerstone of our product development process and conducted regularly. Those 2 respondent groups perform significantly better in the regression analysis than the other 3 groups listed. And in fact, this is sort of a stacked chart. So the very first one, stand-ups being conducted daily, outperform those that are being conducted regularly in our data. So the lesson here is, for those of you who do stand-ups, the more frequently you do them, the more likely you are to have a high-performing team. Notice, though, that 41% of survey respondents, the green bar, say that the stand-ups are effective, but they're not conducted on a regular basis, and this is the tail for the majority of product organizations. Also, notice the other 2 responses, we do stand-ups regularly, but they're ineffective. That's 11%. And then 8% say that stand-ups are contentious and a waste of time on my product team. Our fourth factor had to do with quick problem recovery. And the question we asked in the survey was, how does your company's culture react when unforeseen issues are encountered in the product development process? And almost half of survey respondents say we rally, but it takes a while before we can move past unforeseen issues. About a little over a third say we rally quickly past unforeseen issues, and they tend to perform best. 13% say we get hung up on unforeseen issues, and another 3% say they rarely get past these unforeseen issues. So the regression analysis pointed out that the more nimble organizations are at overcoming unforeseen issues, the more effectively they perform. So nimbleness in terms of overcoming unforeseen issues in the product development process is highly correlated with improved team performance. And it's worth noting, 64% of organizations, roughly 2/3, struggle with this challenge. And finally, as it relates to user experience, collaboration with product management in the product development process, what we see here are a range of phases, if you will, of product development. And if you'll notice for a second that the majority of respondents are indicating that, particularly in the green and the blue bars, the sort of teal-y blue, I guess, that most of their UX resources go towards the time of their resources goes to development of a product or planning of a product, and then it's sort of bookended by the conception of a product or the testing of a product, and it really falls off to the right as you move towards launch of a product or in-market iteration. So a couple things actually are implied in this. First of all, it's pretty clear that UX resources are scarce and that they're being used for high value, high risk, high reward kind of projects at the front end of the process. What we see downstream is that this lack of resources on the UX side, just like it is there's scarcity of resources for product managers in many organizations, tends to focus the resources towards the front end of the process. And where downstream, where user experience professionals would also be very valuable, particularly with iterating on existing products, they're not being used. So there appears to be a scarcity of resources that doesn't enable the UX team to reach as far downstream as perhaps an organization might like. But what our data showed was that active UX involvement in the product development process leads to better outcomes, and right now it's happening primarily on the front end of the process. For those of you who are interested in getting a copy of this presentation covers a lot of the key information from our 2015 white paper, but if you're interested in getting a copy of the more expansive view, there's much more information contained in the white paper. I've included the URL here so that you can download a copy. We'll still have it available probably for another 60 days, at which point we'll be start to transition over to the 2016 white paper activities. And if you are interested in participating in this year's survey, you can do so by clicking on the graphic on our homepage that looks exactly like this. We'd love to hear from you. The more the merrier. We'd like to drive those numbers up as high as possible. And it's your input that helps actually make our study valuable to product team members everywhere.
Hey Greg, this is Rihanna real quick, just to jump in. Yeah. Can you give a sense of how long the survey takes?
Sure, yeah. So the survey is 24 questions, and it takes roughly 7 to 8 minutes, so it's very quick.
Perfect.
Thank you. As it relates to our sponsors, just a shout out to SIIA, Rihanna and Katie, for their continued support. They've been with us since, I think, 2012, helping us get the word out and also to get people actively involved in taking the survey. Our sponsors, Sensor 6 and Project Connections, who make the funding of the survey possible, as well as a range of different promotional partners in the product and project management community who help us also get the word out as well. Also want to just briefly acknowledge the co-sponsors, Matt Jackson, Ron Lichty, who was going to co-present with me today, but who unfortunately had a skiing accident and was unable to attend, and then David Height. The key point here is that every single member of the team represents a different functional area and contribute their expertise to it, and the study wouldn't be possible without them. And then I just want to thank everyone today for your involvement in the study and also listening to our results from this year. So I really appreciate your time. Hope it was a worthwhile investment. And if you have any questions that you want to ask, or if you want to reach out to us for any other reason, feel free. I have my contact information listed here. So with that, Rihanna, why don't I switch back over to you guys on questions that may have emerged.
Great, and I just want to remind everybody, if you have any questions, we have a few here, but if you have any, please go ahead and type them into the chat box to the bottom left of your screen, and we'll get to this. And also, just a reminder, I'm going to scroll back here. If you see there at the bottom right, the website for Actuation Consulting, that is where you can download that white paper that Greg mentioned. I just want to remind everybody of that. I know there was a question regarding that. So I'm going to just jump into a couple of questions here. Going back to your point about Agile and Agile losing steam in last year's data. What do you think that accounts for? And I don't know if you said this or not, and what you expect to see this coming year.
Yeah, no, that's an excellent question. Thanks for asking it. So, what we think is going on with Agile a little bit is, if you think about it, we saw that blended is by far the largest methodology currently used in practice. And there were a lot of organizations that moved towards Agile, but if you think back a couple of years, organizations weren't adopting Agile at the same rate that we saw in 2013. So what we think's been going on has been two things. One is that organizations that might have been waterfall, bigger, maybe $2 billion organizations, as they attempted to make moves towards being more nimble and more agile in their product development methodologies, we think that what's happened is they tend to either pass through or settle on blended methodologies. They maybe can't get all the way to Agile, but they find a better way of practicing it. So we think the numbers reflect a little bit of people who attempted to migrate to Agile but found that maybe they couldn't do it because of organizational constraints. For example, you think about large organizations, multi-billion-dollar organizations, they tend to have annual capital, planning processes, things along those lines, which become constraints in many ways potentially on the process. So these organizational constraints inhibit their ability to fully make the jump, but maybe they move from waterfall to blended, and once again, that's very likely.
That was another question about, why do you think so many companies struggle with nimbleness? And I'm assuming that's exactly the same thing, the organizational constraints, right? Absolutely, yes. I mean, it's a real issue for a lot of organizations that aspire to be more nimble. I think there's another factor that plays into this as well. If a couple years ago, Voc, they're like a consulting organization, did a study that focused on organizations and asking the question how they defined Agile, whether they were Agile and then how they defined it. And while I'm sort of paraphrasing here, I don't remember the exact numbers off the top of my head, but they found that the majority of organizations didn't have a consistent definition of what Agile is. So I think the other thing that we think has been happening now that Agile methodologies have been in play for a while is that organizations are starting to settle out on what Agile is and means to them maybe more consistently than they were in the past. And we think that might also be encapsulated in the numbers that we have today. And looking forward, it's hard to say. In fact, Ron, who is supposed to present with me today, actually believes that what we saw last year with the decrease in Agile and the increase in waterfall is an aberration. I myself am not entirely convinced, but I think we need to see the data this year to confirm that trend is actually a trend or it isn't. So it's really hard to say. If I had to look into a crystal ball, I'm going to guess that there's a little bit of truth in the numbers that showed up last year and that we might see some fall off on Agile's growth rate and maybe even a decrease. And so you can hold me to that for next year when we talk about this. Great. Now, so going into 2016, we talked a little bit about Agile, but what other trends do you expect to see, or what other topics are you guys even taking a closer look at into the coming year, based on the data from the previous year? Are there new topics? Are there some that you're expanding further into? Yeah. So once again, great question. What we typically do every year, it's a little bit like an onion. We keep roughly about 40% of the same questions year over year for trending purposes. Think back to the value, question, because we want to keep that consistent so we can see what the trend is over time. About the other 60% typically are new questions that we add. About maybe 25% of those will be geared towards a topic that caught our interest in the findings from the previous year. So for example, we continue to dive into the user experience area, asking more questions in that area in this year's survey. We also look more closely at requirements and how that process is being managed inside the organization. And then we're also taking a look at outsourcing, the impact of outsourcing on product teams, and that's something new for this year that we've never looked at before. In fact, it's sort of a blue sky space that we've had our eye on for a while, but there were other things that were a little bit more pressing from our perspective, but this is the year that we're going to start to real peel back the onion a little bit there as well. And how do the methodologies you use differ by the size of an organization? I mean, as you get bigger, do you do more or less blended? I mean, what do you see? Yeah, in fact, the previous year we actually overlaid methodology on size of company, and it played out sort of like this.
The less than $50 million companies tended to be agile, or at least more agile. So as you got up in scale, you might have switched to blended, but generally the smaller organizations were attempting to either use Kanban or agile methodologies. As you got to the mid-sized, there was still a large percentage of organizations that were using agile methodologies, but you tended to see the emergence of blended taking real root in the mid-sized companies. And as you moved more towards the large organizations, they were clearly in the waterfall camp, but with an eye towards blended methodologies. We didn't do the overlay for last year, but we do it every 2 years, so we'll probably do it again this year. So it turns out sort of like you would expect. Small organizations tend to utilize agile methodologies. Mid-sized organizations tended to have settled on some combination of the two. And then you get the sense basically from the data that the large organizations are waterfall. They acknowledge it, but they also are trying to make that change. And it shows up consistently in the data.
Mm-hmm. Great. Another question we have here is, which area does QA organization report to in these organizations? Do you have any insight into that?
Yeah, that varies. I think sometimes we see QA as its own department. Other times it's rolling up into the development area. So I'd say it's situational. It's not. I don't know that there's a particular one right way to do it. I think it comes a lot down to the culture and size of organization.
Okay, I have one more question here, and this is actually my question. I'm just curious, out of all these years that you've been doing the survey, what has been the biggest surprise to you?
Well, actually, the first year we conducted the study, we weren't actually focused on product team performance. We were actually trying to understand the interplay between the various functions, because all of our co-authors were from different areas. And so we were sort of just trying to do an exploratory survey looking at how the different functional relationships, the health of them, the implications of dysfunction in those areas. And when we rolled up the survey results and turned it into the statistician, he came back to us and said, my God, these 5 factors that showed up in the regression analysis are highly correlated with product team performance. In fact, it's a stunning number in terms of, if you do these 5 things well, the likelihood that you're going to be high performing, I think the number was 87%. And that actually is what set us on this path. That was the number one shock that we had, because that was not the goal. We sort of backed into this. It wasn't the original intent of our research. And we've stayed that course ever since. Now we've got it up to about 20 different factors that we've uncovered that are all highly correlated with product team performance. And they have varying degrees of impact. We rank them from a magnitude 1 to a magnitude 5. And in fact, when we do consulting, we utilize that scale to help organizations, sort of shore up areas of weakness. But that was the number one thing that we found, Rihanna, that shocked us, because that was not something we were looking for.
It's funny how that happens.
It is.
Well, good. If there's no other questions, if there's any other questions, I'll give you a second to type those in. But if not, then Greg, I do want to thank you again. I want to encourage everybody to take the survey for 2016. As Greg said, it's 7 to 8 minutes. It won't take you long. Feel free to pass it on to your colleagues. That makes sense. Again, we will be sending out a recording to everybody with the presentation, and also a link to the white paper. Looks like I have one more question here. So when you were describing the industry respondents represented, is there any news or representation in the industrial B2B products space?
Yeah, we don't call them out as a separate area. I mean, we give 5 different options basically, as you saw earlier, which is technology, services, consumer products, and then government and education. There are always write-ins because a certain percent of people don't believe that the bucket corresponds. And so there are plenty of people that work in an industrial B2B area who respond to this year's survey or last year's survey. It's just not a category that we've historically tracked.
Got it. Thank you. All right. Well, Greg, thank you so much. Thank you to everybody for attending and participating today and for your great questions. And again, you will receive a follow-up with all the information, and we look forward to hearing the outcome of this year's survey.
Thanks a lot, Rihanna. Thank you, Katie, and thanks to everyone who attended today.
Thank you.